Ryan Day and Brian Hartline have made a habit of going after the talented recruits in South Florida, and they have their eyes set on a talented wide receiver that's a teammate of a current Buckeye commit.
You are Locked On Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Buckeyes for the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Wednesday, December 28th in the year 2022, and I want to thank you for making Locked On Buckeyes your first listen or first watch of every single day. During this episode, we will dive into a lot going on with a couple 2024 recruits that Ohio State has their eyes set on. And when we do that, John Garcia Jr., he is Locked On's football recruiting insider, joins us to discuss these players. Joshisa Trader of Chaminade Madonna, he's going to be one of the guys Buckeyes are going after. We also hit on 2024 tight end Christan Bentancur, and then a preferred walk-on commit from an in-state running back. Don't want to waste any time. Got to bring John in because John has a lot to say about all three of these talented players that the Buckeyes have their eyes on. And as we welcome in John Garcia Jr., he is Locked On's football recruiting insider. I'd like to thank LinkedIn Jobs for being the official college football and college basketball recruiting sponsor across the Locked On College Network. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Terms and conditions apply. John and I last week recapped and discussed the 2023 Ohio State recruiting class during the early signing period. We're kind of turning the page a little bit slightly to 2024. There might be some more commits coming for Ohio State in the 2023 recruiting class. But there are a couple guys that we're going to talk about today that are really, really talented. One's a tight end, but he lines up on the outside. I have not seen a clip of him ever lining up at the end of the line. We'll get to him shortly. But first up for today's show, another kid from South Florida. Chaminade Madonna, the same high school, prep school that Ohio State commit Jeremiah Smith goes to. He's a wide receiver. He's Joshisa Trader, wide receiver, the teammate of Jeremiah Smith. That's a lot to put in there together. Joshisa, I saw, goes by JoJo, and it looks like JoJo's just a dog on the field, and the tandem of him and Jeremiah Smith is just one deadly one. John, what can you tell us about this talented receiver down in South Florida?
Yeah, those are the running mates, right? They're kind of yin and yang, both long, explosive, downfield type threats. I mean, JoJo transferred to Chaminade this year, and he fit right in, right there with Jeremiah. And they've got a whole nother year to do that together with their quarterback, by the way. Cedric Bailey is also a 2024 guy. So this state champion group is probably going to be favored to win it all again next year, and those receivers are really the core reason why. Jeremiah probably a little bit more polished, a little smoother at this stage. JoJo's explosive, right? He'll flash a little bit more, one-handed catches. I mean, just unreal body control that he brings to the table. So as he rounds out his game and polishes up a little bit, both of them are going to be like 1-2, maybe nationally at wide receiver. Like they're going to go back and forth as the two best receivers in the country, and they're on the same high school team. So it's kind of absurd to think about. But yeah, JoJo's just as coveted as Jeremiah. Of course, Jeremiah off the board already to Ohio State. JoJo just dropped that top 5. He's got the in-state trio on there, Miami, Florida, Florida State. And then the two schools that, really have commanded his attention over the last year or so, Ohio State and Tennessee. So naturally, the Buckeyes, look, it's a wide receiver. The Buckeyes want him. He's a Floridian. I mean, it's like that is hard to beat, right? I mean, that's been the formula for so very long, going back to Benjamin Victor and those guys. But in this case, he's got Jeremiah right there in his ear, already hey, come to Ohio State, come do it. Let's go do this together. Reminds me a little bit of Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis, that relationship that was fostered really through 7-on-7. And then these two guys play on that same 7-on-7 team. They're the next wave of receivers there at the South Florida Express, which obviously have a great relationship with Ryan Day and Ohio State. So he's going to have Ohio State in his ear from his former teammates in Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis, his current teammate in Jeremiah Smith. So it's going to be hard for anybody else to win this recruitment. He's already labeled Ohio State as his dream school. He's already been to Columbus a bunch of times. He was one of the billions of kids up there for that Notre Dame game. And I think he went back one more time this fall. So the pedigree at wide receiver, the personal connections at wide receiver are going to really be hard for anybody to overcome relative to Ohio State. But I do think he's going to take his time. I don't think he's going to pop as soon as we saw with Jeremiah Smith. I think he'll take his time a little bit longer and dig into some of these other options that he has. So he does some due diligence. You know, I think obviously Miami is under construction and they're going to push very hard to keep him close to home. Tennessee, much newer to the list for a lot of these elite wide receivers based on what they're doing on the field. I think he'll vet that a little bit more. But the Ohio State angle in particular is one that's already kind of set in stone for him. So I think if he trims his list from 5 to 4 or 3 or 2, Ohio State is going to stay in this thing all the way until the end. And it's hard to view anyone else as a favorite at this stage because of all those connections to Columbus.
John, we talk a lot about players that are two-sport athletes or multi-sport athletes, and JoJo's is one of those that fits that category. I don't know if he's still doing the track and field events that he was previously, but I did see he did throw the javelin at one point in time and do long jump. Can you talk about how those two events in track and field translate to the football field?
You know, those are explosive core-based events, right? Obviously, for the long jump, you're talking about calculation, right? So you're like running a route into that long jump mark, and then it's pure explosiveness and technique. So that's obviously something that translates specifically, I would say, to wide receiver. And then the javelin, same deal. You're transferring a lot of power. You have to have that low center of gravity, and then technically you've got to have great form and core strength to execute the javelin at a high level. All principles we talk about with playing wide receiver, whether you're running route, breaking off the route, playing the football at its apex, winning a contested catch, all those same motor skills have to be in line. So I think that absolutely helps Josiah. Again, he's this flashy player, man. He's so explosive. If he puts it all together, it'll be scary. And that's kind of, again, the yin and yang between these two. Do you go with the high floor of Jeremiah Smith? Because we already seen it, right? We already know he is there right now. Or do you go with the ceiling, the intrigue, and the explosiveness of Jojo Trader, where you're like, we see it sometimes, but if he puts it all together, it's kind of absurd. So that's perfectly in line with what Ohio State's been doing at that position as well.
In college, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, these two athletes, teammates, receivers, both commit to Ohio State. I'm not getting ahead of myself. I understand it's a long, drawn-out process and want to take their time. But let's just say they're teammates in college. Do you see a situation where it's one guy's on one side of the field and the other's on the other, or do you see one being a slot and one being an outside receiver on the same side?
Yeah, they're both over 6 feet, so traditionally you would expect them to be opposites of each other, but they're both so explosive, and Smith is so polished that you can absolutely work them in the slot. They're comfortable there. They've moved around. Again, playing 7-on with the older guys, with Ennis and Tate and those guys, kind of relegates them sometimes, right? They have to move around by default because you're not getting Brandon Ennis off of his spot, right? So I think those practices, just those events have helped them to round out their game even further. And we have seen Chaminade put them on the same side together, which is, I can imagine as a high school defensive coordinator trying to deal with that. I'm like, hey, bail coverage, get a safety over the top. I don't care if they run the ball for 10 yards a pop. We're just not letting these two guys beat us. And that's the same kind of problem they could present at the next level should they team up. And again, I just think it's hard to envision another favorite at this stage because of all of those circumstances. They're built similarly. They've come up similarly. They play together. They have so many ties and friends at Ohio State at the position where we just say, hey, if Ohio State wants you at receiver, everyone else has to deal with it. It's just part of where recruiting is for that program at that position under Brian Hartline, and all of those things are still in place going into the 24 cycle. So you had the best receiving core in the 23 cycle, and every year prior you were right in that mix. And if you start putting these guys together in 24, that one's going to become quite impossible to beat as well. So that's just it's just hard for everyone else to deal with that. Although, again, those in-state schools, they're going to get a hard look. They're going to get vetted as much as possible in this race. But even still, the dream school label, the connections, the production, the precedent is all right there for Ohio State.
John, when I first saw the graphic of JoJo's top 5, I saw Miami, and I saw Ohio State, and I saw Tennessee. That was where my eyeball stopped. Now, I saw the 5 on the graphic, the number 5, and I saw those 3 schools. I didn't even look to see what the other 2 schools were, because I know Miami and Tennessee, they're starting to trend to get some of that top-tier talent once again in Knoxville and in Coral Gables. But then I saw Florida State in Florida. I'm like, wait, so you're saying that Ohio State has to battle with all 3 of the in-state schools? And that's going to be tough, but you keep talking about the connection, the South Florida connection, Brian Hartline, the South Florida Express. Do you think that will be something, that connection alone, that could be a big deciding factor where he leans towards Columbus and Ohio State and forsaking the 3 schools that are inside the Sunshine State?
Absolutely. You have to remember, these kids, while they're aware of the in-state history, tradition, and obviously, look, Mario Cristobal is a recruiter. Everybody knows that. They're going to try and work to keep the best South Floridians in South Florida. That's, everybody's been calling for that for a long time from them. But at the same time, this generation of recruit, they weren't alive or coherent for Sean Taylor and Ed Reed and Andre Johnson and Clinton Portis and Ken Dorsey and those guys. They weren't a part of that. That to them, that's just a Netflix or YouTube thing, right? It's not something they have lived through. Even more modern success in state with the Tebow Gators or the Jameis Winston Seminoles, they really don't remember that vividly, right? They were very, very young. So it's not the same as it was 10 years ago trying to pull an elite skill player from South Florida. And again, that track record, that history at Ohio State that's alive right now at that position, I think will stand alone in this race. But again, there will be some in-state pull. I think Miami in particular is going to be hard to overcome because of the effort that will come from Coral Gables to keep him close to home. But look, everyone's looking up at Ohio State as far as I view this thing today. Can it change? Will it change? We'll see. College football is extremely fluid, but one of the most stable things in the sport is what that school is doing at that position. And a JoJo Trader isn't going to settle, for lack of a better phrase. I mean, he thinks he's the best. He's going to compete with the best. That's why he transferred to Chaminade, and I think that's why Ohio State's going to be tough to beat there in the end.
From one really talented wide receiver in the class of 2024 to a tight end who also plays on the outside is Christan Bentancur. He's a 2024 tight end standing at 6'5", 240 pounds out of Marion Central Catholic in Woodstock, Illinois. I said it before to you, John. I said it just a minute ago. This guy, 6'5", 240, has a frame of a tight end that you might want starting in college right away, but he has this in high school. But, John, this cat lines up on the outside a lot. And from what I've seen so far, 6'5", 240 on the outside, he knows how to high point the ball, knows how to run numerous routes. And he could be more of that new age type of tight end playing in college. His final 3, Oregon, Clemson, and Ohio State. The battle of Clemson and Ohio State continues. This man's talented, John. JoJo's talented, but Bentancur brings something different to the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, he's kind of an overwhelming physical presence, as you mentioned. That frame relegated to just playing outside is – imagine that in Illinois, right? I mean, that's hard to deal with for a high schooler in particular. But then he's got this speed and these ball skills on top of it. You expect a wide catch radius, the physicality to win contested catches over smaller players. And yeah, that stuff is there. But it's the downfield ability, the ball tracking, that really impresses you here. And that comfort, the comfort in playing outside and running routes as if you're a JoJo Trader instead of being this 6'5" tight end projection. So I think that's just a flash of modern football.
A
Get your
big
best
flag.
player in space and let him go to work. So anything else will have to be more in the developmental phase for Ohio State or Clemson or Oregon, wherever he ends up. But that athletic foundation can certainly branch you out to more balance and other things.
From what you've seen of him as a blocker, even if it's on the outside, do you think that transition from outside blocking at the receiver spot to inside blocking at the end of the offensive line, do you think that transition will be hard for him?
I do. I think when you talk about a guy who's so comfortable and used to working outside, everything is different when you go inside, even your stance,
Yeah.
how you come off the football. Now you are in a 3-point stance as opposed to a 2-point split leg stance as a wide receiver. So even just coming off the football will feel relatively different. But look, I mean, these kids in the off season and off script, I mean, they're going to work at their perceived weaknesses, especially the higher level blue chip recruits. So I'm sure if he hasn't already, he's about to start working on coming out of a 3-point stance, playing a little bit more in line on working with some of the bigger bodies, at least at the high school level. But look, at the same time, he's a good blocker in space. He's comfortable there. He's got great extension and length. Obviously, that's always going to help you as a blocker. And you can't be that explosive without some lower body power. We talked about the build that he brings at 6'5", 240. He's got some lower body ability, and that will help him both anchor and drive when he does line up in line and eventually block. Not to mention, he's a 24 kid, so he's got a whole nother year of high school ball to go. He's theoretically 12, 13 months away from beginning his college career at the earliest. So I think if you're already down to 3 schools, you're probably committing sooner rather than later. So once he does to whichever school Christian picks, they're going to start to talk about, hey, this is the role we have for you. And he'll start to develop and work on some of those outside the box areas thereafter. But, it'll still be a transition for sure. But the physicality, the frame, and the explosiveness already lie there along with that length. So I think all of that will help him make that transition, but it certainly won't be easy.
John, you mentioned something that just popped into my mind as you were discussing the conversations these coaches will have about his role in their offense. If it's Dabo Swinney or Ryan Day, whoever the coach is, you're discussing, hey, your role is what we see you as a Buckeye or as a Tiger. When it comes to a kid who's playing tight end, always on the outside, do you have that initial conversation on the first visit, first in-home visit, like, hey, we see what you do now, but here's how we think your role is going to be at our school? Or do you kind of wait till later on to feel the process out to see if he's leaning towards you? Like, when do they have that true conversation about their role at the next level at that school?
That's a great question. I think as you get more familiar, that stuff comes up a little bit more. We tend, in this business, to focus on visits as the primary points of communication and contact between coach and prospect. But in reality, Jay, these conversations are going on all the time. If he's already down to 3 schools, it's not just, I visited these 3 schools this fall, which he did, and hey, I love those 3, and they're going to be my final 3. No, it's the Twitter DMs, it's the texts, it's the FaceTimes, it's the overall communication between these offensive coordinators and tight end coaches in particular that have helped those 3 schools ascend to the top of the list for him. So I would imagine for him, having narrowed things so far, I mean, look, this is a kid who had 30-something scholarship offers. Narrowing it by this much tells you that those relationships, those plans are something he's in line with both personally and positionally. So that those conversations, I believe, Jay, are already underway. And it's just going to pick up more and more as he gets closer to a commitment and obviously being a true freshman somewhere.
Ohio State saw an uptick in production for the tight end position this year with Cade Stover. I believe he had 35 receptions, 399 receiving yards, I believe 5 receiving touchdowns, which is different for an Ohio State tight end, which is not someone utilized in this way in the passing game. Well, Christan Bentancur, I didn't get his junior numbers, stats, John. I got his numbers from a sophomore year of high school. 49 receptions, 1,020 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns. That's a guy that Ryan Day wants on his school, in his program. If you're doing that on the outside, think about if we can work with you and transition you and refine your skills and make you more of a tight end that can be not just great in college, but also potentially really, really good in the NFL. Bring you inside, work you a little bit, keep your route running as polished and refining those types of things. that could be something as well that not only helps Ohio State with Ryan Day, but also helps Ryan Day in recruiting future guys, saying Cade Stover was already here. We did some good things with him. Bring in this 2024 kid, Bentancur, and he's raising the bar as well. Tight ends might look at Ohio State differently if Bentancur comes to Columbus and does some of that magic in Columbus in the shoe every Saturday.
That's a good point. You know, that there's really not a lot of positions where Ohio State feels limited from a recruiting standpoint. But yeah, you could argue that tight end is one of them because of the conventional usage of that player at that position. Like you said, it's starting to push in the other direction a little bit, which makes sense because there's so much attention on the passing game and these wide receivers every year at Ohio State. So naturally, tight end's going to have an opportunity to open up going forward. So yeah, I think it's something that absolutely can help after you start to break out and modernize a little bit more at that spot. So that's a really good point to bring up. And again, with this type of, with Christian, you'd rather deal with him being athletic and so comfortable outside working against DBs and have to develop him elsewhere than the opposite, where he's basically just a smaller offensive lineman and you're like, hey, this is how you run a route. This is how you catch the football. You know, you'd rather do it the other way where you're just teaching him how to play a little bit more in the trenches. And even then, you're bringing in most likely multiple tight ends, most recruiting cycles. So you're going to ask these guys to do different things. So Christian will inevitably, if he picks the Buckeyes, be kind of the hybrid, the mobile, the dual threat type tight end. And then maybe you bring in another classic inline type as well. So even as you ask him to develop more in line, you're probably not going to line him up there every single down in college anyway.
Last but not least, there's an in-state prospect. Now he's a commit out of Washington High School in Massillon, Ohio. He's a running back, a 3-star running back who is a preferred walk-on, recently committed to Ohio State. And this young man broke school records, broke single-season records. This young man is a baller. I saw him stand listed at 5'9", 200 pounds. Johnny had 10 FBS offers, one from a Power 5 school in Boston College. He ultimately decided to stay in-state and be a preferred walk-on at Ohio State. What did you see when watching film and clips and tape on this young man that you loved or liked while you saw him on the football field?
Yeah, Willtrell can play. This was kind of surprising to stumble upon as a preferred walk-on, turning down, like you said, a bunch of FBS attention, including at least one Power 5 offer. This is a 2,000-yard back, 30-plus touchdowns as a senior in 2022. You mentioned the build, 5'9", 200 pounds, classic conventional running back build, and he plays to those strengths. The vision, the balance,
yes,
the leverage that he runs with is really consistent. He's got enough speed to pick up plays in chunks, but he's kind of a churner. He's kind of, to me, a guy who works better as the game goes on. He can work in space to a strong degree. I think the screen and the swing game here makes a lot of sense as a pass catcher, but really running the football, low center of gravity, great vision and patience, and then he hits the hole as he needs to. So he can switch gears and get to his top speed relatively quickly. And he's got that physical foundation to be pretty tough to bring down thereafter. So I really like this get. You know, Massillon High School there in Ohio is a big-time program that everybody knows about, a lot of state titles, a lot of accolades with that school. So for him to have multiple records there, I think does say a lot about the consistency and the production that he brings to the game. Now, he is not as flashy or as high ceiling as a Travion Henderson or somebody like that, but at the floor level, he's experienced, he's mature, he's polished from a technical standpoint. Again, patience, vision, execution, very high on his list of strengths. So to grab a guy like that as a preferred walk-on just kind of screams about the luxury that Ohio State operates with from a recruiting perspective. I think he could have been a borderline headlining recruit at a lot of other Power 5 or FBS programs. I mean, Trent Dilfer and UAB took a late swing on him just a couple weeks ago, and he would have been one of their high-profile guys. So I do think this is a great walk-on opportunity. You want walk-ons to be productive, easily known, and in-state in particular. So he checks all those boxes.
John, last thing for you. Last year, the Buckeyes had a commit from four-star. We was a four-star recruit out of Tennessee, Dallin Hayden, who Buckeye fans grew to love. He played more due to injury, and he got thrust on Front Street and played very well as a true freshman for the Buckeyes. Now, that's a true freshman commit who played well. How do you separate these guys who's a preferred walk-on in Hartson and a commit, one-star difference between the two guys for people that follow the recruiting star rating system like that? What separates Hartson and Hayden as far as one being a commit and one being a preferred walk-on?
Yeah, well, Hayden I think was just a little bit more explosive, a guy who you could project down the road, still having this room to improve, as to where I think Winslow's a little bit more conventional, a little bit more old school in his strengths, a little bit more floor laden than ceiling laden, but they're not 100% dissimilar from a frame standpoint and from a skill set standpoint. I just think Hayden a little bit more explosive, a little bit more room to add to his frame coming out of Tennessee last cycle. But a lot of this stuff has to do with circumstance, Jay. There was no running back committed to Ohio State in this cycle. The numbers were what they were. I think they signed 20 guys last week. So if you can fill in a spot without allocating a scholarship at a position of need, it just hits differently. And we've seen so many injuries and turnover in that running back room that not signing one out of high school was a bit of a surprise. And this is kind of like the next best thing, to bring in a preferred walk-on within your home state lines, who's again bringing a lot to the table. He's one that in a couple of years you'd be surprised if he was still not on scholarship, in my opinion.
John, it's always fun. Hope you had a Merry Christmas with your family and the young and the newborn there with you as well. Hope you're ready to have some fun this weekend. College football playoff, Buckeyes are playing, and the other bowl games as well. John, last thing for you here quickly. Could you please let everyone know where they can follow you on Twitter and also follow you on SI? But also, it just hit me. This is the last time we'll talk to you before the Buckeyes and Georgia battle it out in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl. Who do you have winning that game?
Man, I was talking about this on a pod last night. Every time I think about this playoff, I feel like the winner of this semifinal has the best opportunity to win it all. And then the matchup is such a matchup of opposites, right? Georgia just presses you offensively with the running game, and defensively, obviously, incredibly aggressive. So Ohio State has to manufacture comfort for C.J. Stroud. Can they do that against that vaunted, aggressive Georgia defense? I think it's that thin of a margin between these two schools, because you're like, if any school can mess with Georgia in this Final Four, to me, it's Ohio State because of its ability to score. They had more time to get healthy, more time to game plan compared to every other school playing, because they didn't play in a conference title game. So I think all of that could be advantageous. And Buckeyes, they really don't have nothing to lose in this game. They're not favored. They're going against the defending champs. This could easily just be a throwaway type game from a public perception standpoint. So I do think it's going to be a lot closer than people think. And it comes down to that matchup to me, because Georgia's going to be able to move the football and score. I think we can all assume that. Very similar to Michigan in their offensive philosophy. That it just doesn't match up well for the Buckeyes. So it goes to C.J. Stroud in that offensive game. Can you manufacture comfort for him? I think they could. I just don't know if it'll be enough, because it's just Georgia's so well-rounded, so good, so consistent. So I think it would take one of the better games of C.J. Stroud's career and one of the better coached games from that offensive staff under Ryan Day. You've got to manufacture space, roll the pocket, move the pocket, get CJ on the run, utilize CJ's legs, some things that we haven't asked Ohio State to do consistently this year. But you've got plenty of time to prepare for it, and obviously you've got nothing to lose with your back against the wall. So I think it'll be a tight game. I do think Georgia just is more complete of a team at this stage, though.
John, where can people follow you on Twitter and hit you up on SI?
Yeah, si.com/college, and bug me on Twitter. Come talk some trash about Ohio State, Georgia at John Garcia _JR. Can't wait to watch that one.
And guys, you can follow me on Twitter at jstevens07. Send your emails to jstevens317@gmail.com. Didn't realize this was the last time we're going to talk to John before the big game this weekend, but I love having John on. Love getting John's insight to the three talented recruits we talked about today. And can't wait till the next time we get to talk to John, because we haven't talked to John about Dylan Raiola's decommitment, quarterbacks the Buckeyes might go after. That might be a teaser for what we get to talk to John about next time he's on the show. John, thanks thanks for coming on the podcast once again. I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir, Jay. Thanks for having me, man. If I don't talk to you, Happy New Year, all that stuff too.